everybody, and welcome back to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. I am so excited to bring to you a series of podcasts, two of them during the month of May, with my friend Jeremy Fox. Jeremy comes to us as a trauma-informed counselor whose modality is EMDR. He has been on the podcast before, but he is a trauma specialist with a heart to help people. So Jeremy, welcome to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast.
Thanks, Amy. It's really good to be here. We always have great conversations, and I'm sure we're going to have an awesome one today that'll benefit all your amazing listeners.
Well, thank you. And I apologize because I forgot to hit record. You had given me this beautiful answer to one of the first questions I'm getting ready to ask you, but you're going to give it to us again. But Jeremy, this is May of 2023, 3 years since I started the podcast. I started the podcast after the pandemic started. And so as I began to think about, I knew I wanted you on for May to talk to my listeners about Mental Health Awareness Month, because you're so knowledgeable, particularly because your specialty is trauma, and my listeners are a bunch of people who have been through a lot of trauma. And today we're going to talk about really how we all have that in common. And so as we were putting together the episode, we talked a little bit about doing an episode on how the pandemic has affected the mental health of those of us living, at least in America. And so I want to start off by asking you, and you answered this question beautifully a few minutes ago, about those early days and when the pandemic happened. We all went on lockdown. I think you said you were in Colorado at the time, and suddenly therapists like yourself had to find a way to still see their clients without spreading COVID. And so can you talk to us a little bit, just right out of the gate, because I don't think that we really think of this very often from a therapist standpoint, and you are here today, by the way, for educational purposes only, but we don't often think about what it must have been like as a therapist when everything shut down and you've got a docket full of people that you're supposed to be seeing. And so talk to us from your perspective, because we had to do the ultimate pivot for everything, but as it pertains to mental health, we had to ultimately pivot. Can you talk to us about those early days and the challenges and kind of how you handled it as a therapist?
Yeah, absolutely. So for one thing, I never really thought about the fact that being a therapist is a job with such a capacity to transmit illness. Like, if you think about it, it's a little bit bizarre to think about that, but I was seeing sometimes 6 clients a day, 7 clients a day in and out of my office. Think about that. If someone was sick or gave that to me, think about what a massive vector for transmission that would be. So when COVID hit, I think all of us in the mental health and healthcare in general professions began to think of these kind of scenarios, like if someone comes in coughing or something. Now, remember, like, let's go back to March 2020. Because I remember that vividly when we were just hearing about the COVID cases increasing exponentially. So I was living in Colorado and I was working in a community mental health care setting. So a clinic with multiple locations. And at that point, whatever the clinic decided was going to be what I had to go with. So, and when COVID began, we didn't have any guidelines yet. It was kind of business as usual until mid to late March. At the beginning of April is really when some new guidelines came into play, right? So we began to do Zoom therapy only with clients. And if they couldn't work Zoom, well, we would have to get on the phone with them, teach them how to do that. And some clients were not as technologically savvy as others. And so they had to use Zoom or the phone. That was it. There was no capacity there for leeway, no debate on that. And I had people really confused about wanting to meet. And I had to say, like, I'm sorry, that's not, just for safety reasons, it's not going to work. So as a therapist, a massive pivot. Now, as a millennial therapist, that my answer is going to be somewhat different.
Yeah.
Someone who hadn't used Zoom. So funny you bring this up. I started podcasting a little earlier and doing some interviews and things like that before 2020. So I already knew how to use Zoom to a large extent. Thank God I did, because then I would be teaching myself and clients at that point if I didn't. So, but still, people didn't have computers. People didn't have the kind of computers that could use Zoom, didn't have smartphones. Like, these were things that we just didn't have to consider if clients had a phone, had a car, and or a way to get on the bus, or so if they used public transit or their own transportation to get to therapy, that was it. Zoom wasn't even used in Colorado that much, like at agency settings for billing purposes in blizzards, because guess what? Insurance didn't really have those codes built in. It didn't really have the stuff for teletherapy baked into it. And so one good thing that's come out of the pandemic for mental health care is that if people need remote care, that often will be covered easier. There will be, now not always, and I think it's within reason that you have to use. I think there's something about in-person care that often works really well. There's no buffering, right? There's no connection issues unless you just aren't having a good conversation, right? But there's no technological issues in person. So I think that transition for me was one I had to walk a huge caseload of clients through. If I'm sorry, this is what we're going to do now, because it's better than you contracting an illness or giving it to me and me giving it to tons of other clients, because there was no vaccine, there was no anything at that point. We were dealing with an unknown virus, working in a profession where we were exposed and exposing ourselves to tons of clients, where if we got sick, that was it. We would have exposed dozens of people at a time.
Right. Yeah, it was not ideal.
That's a great way to put it.
It was not ideal. I am grateful that it seems that some of the laws and insurance companies have kept with being able to do therapy over Zoom. But you bring up so many good points, access to internet signal, access to hardware, access to the knowledge of being able to do it. And you also brought something up that I thought was interesting, and that it was not particularly effective for those diagnosed with ADHD. Can you explore a little bit on that for me?
So ADHD, yeah, that's a great point. People with ADHD can often struggle with maintaining focus on screens. And I had clients just firsthand tell me that it was therapy over the computer is very much like watching a video or something, or like homework, or really schoolwork, classroom work. So for teen clients and young adults who, again, so they moved all Zoom stuff, and they were being charged by many institutions the same as they would have for in-person stuff, which is its own debate right there that we could talk about. Is there something lost in the Zoom presentation? Well, apparently not to many schools, at least according to their finances. So I would say with ADHD clients, there's a generalization effect of the stimulus of Zoom, like what we're using now, or any online modality where it was screen-based, to the kind of stuff they were doing with classroom at work, with lectures from teachers. And it felt the same to them. Again, just according to several clients I know of who had ADHD. And I completely understood that, because if you put a video on in the background to do homework like I used to do, or like it's difficult to not equate Zoom therapy with that. Like, obviously you're someone speaking to you, and that's very different than a static video that just talks at you. But not having that immediate face-to-face three-dimensional interaction, right, where you're seeing someone in person and you're keeping your focus on them, there's something lost there. And even like you can't walk with your clients or do something that's more kinesthetic on the computer, like. And we know that bilateral eye movement, not even just with EMDR therapy, but with moving forward, right? There's an Andrew Huberman video about this. Like it signals to our brain, the bilateral eye movement, side to side, that's all that means, bilateral, that we're moving forward. And I think there's less of that required when you're on a screen. The tinier the screen is, you can keep your eyes static, and you get what happens then, boredom for ADHD clients. So we're asking a lot of them to do Zoom classes all day and take notes and be talked at. And then on top of that, to do Zoom therapy. I think, again, though, I mean, what was the alternative? Places didn't want to get sued potentially for others getting COVID. The vaccine hadn't come out, so you couldn't put it on that and say, well, if you're not vaccinated, that's what happens. So instead, what happened was places took on the burden themselves, like, oh, we don't want to expose people, so you're not allowed in. You got to do Zoom stuff. Sorry. Again, I understand it, but the side effects are something that we can point to and say, well, in the future, this is something maybe that we need to think about.
Yeah, and there's so much to unpack there, particularly because your specialty is trauma specialty,
Hmm.
and your preferred modality, and an effective one, and one that I've used, and one that I did not get to use during those early months of COVID was EMDR. I mean, my counselor tried all kinds of different things to help me bilaterally stimulate, whether it was patting on my legs while he was talking to me. But there is no question that during those early months of COVID, that we as a country, we as in the mental health profession, we did the best we could, but unfortunately it was not good enough. Now, I don't know what we could have done differently, but the fact of the matter is that we know, just based on opening our eyes, that this country, this world has been traumatized by the COVID-19 pandemic and by everything after that. And I'm talking George Floyd, I'm talking turning on our news today, that, every day you're turning on the news and you're seeing something in our country that is triggering to even people who don't have trauma, right? And so I want to dive into that a little bit. And I want to go back to basics just for a second, because this is Mental Health Awareness Month. You are the specialist, in my opinion, on this. So let's first talk about the actual definition of trauma. So you are a trauma specialist, and we are going to talk about in a few minutes how all of us have been through trauma. And but let's first talk about, because trauma, the words trauma, triggering, they're all very buzzwords right now, and I kind of wish that we could figure out a different way to say things, because a trigger is a trigger, but a trigger is a trigger when it comes to PTSD in particular, right? So I think some of these words have been used too much. But so somebody will be like, I'm traumatized, and because somebody took my parking space. That's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
Can you tell us, at its bare bones, what is trauma?
Absolutely. So there's several different definitions that we could go from. One of them is too much, too soon. That's something. I know Janina Fisher is a really good person to look to for definitions. Peter Levine defines trauma as really composed of two parts, of being immobilized and feeling endangered. And I use that definition quite often with clients because it's really a formula for what we do to get out of it. So you look at, riding a roller coaster by choice. Okay. So you're restricted, but you know that it's a safe ride. So you're not in danger. If you get in an elevator and you don't have an elevator phobia, you're restricted, but you're not in danger. Right. Or if you think about this, if you're in a situation where you're in danger, but you can flee, and you fled the situation, well, statistically, you're much less likely to contract PTSD. So we know that an escape route is something that offsets prevalence of trauma. So when you are immobilized, though, and something's done to you, or you're afraid for your life, or you witness other people harmed, right? That is a traumatic event. So you can use that definition in many situations. You can use it for a single episode trauma like car accidents. You can use it for systematic trauma and abuse that happens from a young age onward. So what that does is it lets us fit in people's experiences and look at what elements there consisted of that. And usually the way out is through now bringing the brain from bringing those memory networks from the past into the present and saying, okay, so look around, you're in the present now. As you're thinking about that traumatic memory through EMDR therapy, what are you noticing now in the present? How continue to move your eyes left and right. And it's like, well, that brings the brain into the present, because that element of trauma makes people feel that traumatic aspect is feeling immobilized, feeling you can't do anything different, feeling like being trapped.
Yeah.
So it's Levine says it's an individual's capacity to respond to a perceived threat being insufficient. So leading to a state of helplessness and feeling overwhelmed. Now I pulled that up. It's basically what I was saying, just expanded out. So anybody out there, listener wise, who wants to learn more about what trauma is from an expert position, check out Peter Levine, Levine. He's just brilliant. I defer to
I
him.
couldn't agree more. Yeah, I
Yeah.
couldn't agree more. And it's interesting because what you just described to me is feeling immobilized or endangered. And so on March, let's call it 15th, 2020, we all
Mhm.
turned on our TVs with the president of the United States standing in front of a podium saying, hey, I have asked all the governors in all 50 states to issue safer at home orders, whatever that's, I think ours was called shelter in place in Florida. But that single decision both immobilized us, and we're turning on the TV. And I don't know about you, this is probably not healthy on my part, but at 5:30, 6 o'clock every night, I would turn on and listen to the White House press conference about how they were ordering respirators and bringing ships into New York and all the things. And so what you just described to me, when the COVID pandemic hit, we all were immobilized, and whether that be physically immobilized, like stay in your homes, or some of us may have frozen because those of us with trauma in our background, it probably completely freaked us out. But then we were scared. Like you said, we didn't know what we were dealing with. There was no vaccine. There was very little research on this particular strain of the SARS-CoV-19 virus. And so we were a nation gripped by fear. And you brought a term to my purview this morning that I thought was really interesting as we talk about this, and how we talk about, I think everybody listening to this podcast doesn't need me to read statistics that everything from suicide attempts to drug abuse to alcohol abuse, domestic violence, all the ills of society are exponentially up still, even though technically we're out of the pandemic. And so you brought this term to me called cultural trauma. And I want to park there for a second, because I don't think that that it just refers to the COVID-19 pandemic. So talk to us a little bit about what cultural trauma is, and then we'll go from there.
Sure, I definitely. So it's defined as a shared experience that leaves an indelible mark on the collective memory of a society, often leading to a re-evaluation of the group's identity. So that is from Alexander C. We can expand on that and look at how that impacts people in different marginalized communities. Okay, we can look at how that impacts people in the African-American community, in communities that have been maligned or been the subject of ridicule in different societies at different times. That's the original intent of that, because that definition is from 2004. So
Right.
clearly that's before COVID.
And I've got one here from October of 2019. So a little bit.
For that.
This one is cultural trauma is a related concept, and occurs when members of a group feel that they have been subjected to horrendous events that leaves indelible marks on their group consciousness, forever making their memories and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. And that is from the American Psychological Association in 2019. So subjected to horrendous events that leaves indelible marks on their group consciousness, forever marking their memories. Now, this forever mark on their memories, when I read that part, so now we're talking about traumas experienced as a culture. Now, as you mentioned, you're a millennial. I don't know how old you were in September 1st, or September 11, 2001, but that was the first cultural trauma that I remember in my adult life. And when I look at this definition, forever marking their memories and changing their future identity, I'm not so sure about the future identity part, and we'll get to that in just a second, because I think that can be counseled out. But I remember obviously we all remember where we were on September 11th, 2001. And so that even fits the definition of cultural trauma that the world went through, because more than Americans died that day. And so do you agree, though, that it changes us in ways that can't be unchanged?
No, I think so. I think a lot of those definitions are going to be phrased with a hidden sort of prepositional phrase or clause that would say, unless other intervention is attempted, right? So I think yes, and I think yes, that would impact people permanently if there's no attempt at overcoming that. Like if the system stays closed, the status remains at the quo, right? So that's how I would put that. We can look at like future identity elements of somewhat learned helplessness. So we know from studies in positive psychology that if you leave an animal in a situation where there's no escape and you shock them, like there's some terrible experiments out there, but and you have no escape, that when you finally leave an escape option, the animal has been so desensitized to that and has just accepted that there's no escape from the punishment that it won't attempt it. So that's the change to the identity there. That's the future aspect of that, is that someone won't attempt to do anything different because they don't know that it would work. And so when you intervene with that, with EMDR therapy or any other kind of really evidence-based trauma therapy, help the person's brain orient to the present, then they will view future options differently. I mean, I think for COVID, an example of it would be people who still are afraid to socialize, even when they've taken as many precautions as you can possibly take. So they probably need to get therapy for that. Because there are, I mean, they probably need to, if people were already shy, they already had social anxiety, COVID really reinforced avoidance. Again, I'm not getting bombastic here saying people should push against that every day or that they should have interacted unsafely during COVID pandemic. No, but what I am saying is that if people already didn't want to show their faces and they covered it up and that was a safety blanket or things like that, and it pivoted into a comfort zone that further and further isolated them, and it actually, they wish they could interact more, but it made them more phobic to quarantine. Than post-quarantine life, they're more phobic of just fearful of social interactions. Then that does require some intervention. If they don't need social interactions, have more of a schizoid personality loadout, which is the case with some people, then that's fine. Like, everyone doesn't need the same amount of socialization. But the traumatic aspect of that is fearing other people as vectors of transmission. That's a tough thing. That's very, we need, most people need social engagement as a way to be present focused and to feel important. And so removing that and fearing other people is certainly a traumatic event that, if you don't intervene, meaning don't overcome and reprocess those traumatic memories or the fears, it will impact people's future trajectory for building friendships and for being safe in socializing, feeling safe, feeling appreciated.
And I think one of the questions, and you may or may not have insight on this, but why? So we locked down, we social distanced. Many people lost their jobs. Many people lost family members or friends. I lost a friend. You almost at this point would be hard pressed to talk to someone who doesn't know someone that died from the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah. And I kind of want to let that sit for a second. And so we are all walking around this planet right now. And I can't stress enough, Jeremy just said exactly what the purpose of this podcast. One of the C's on this podcast is counseling. And we, as a collective society who have endured a cultural trauma that we all have in common, in the COVID-19 pandemic, it affected us all differently, but it affected us all. And so, Jeremy, there are those out there who, like you said, may have already been a little introspective, may have already been, a little introverted, stayed at home, didn't had social anxiety, all the things. And so obviously the COVID-19 pandemic made this more difficult. But the thing that is really breaks my heart the most is the almost double-digit increases that we're seeing in suicide, for example. And when we use that definition of cultural trauma, it talks about your future identity. And so for those listening out there, mostly, who have not sought help, is that the reason why we're seeing an increase in suicide? Because people just simply, did they stop functioning psychologically? Did they can't find a way out? Why are we seeing an increase in suicide in particular?
So this is a question that we could say probably is multi-determined. It's got many different factors. It's not just one, but they all cohere together to be more than the sum of their parts, probably to exponent. I'm throwing out a lot of scientific words here, so let me put it simply. There's many different reasons why we're seeing that. We were already seeing suicide rates for men in particular pretty alarmingly high before 2020. So I think there's been kind of a bottleneck effect where people that were already upset and experiencing clinical grade depression were hastened along and plummeted into a new level of depression by the COVID pandemic and the isolation therein. And post-isolation culture, where I think people were so depleted from continuous fight or flight, and that depleted what we could call surge capacity, which is a really cool term. That, and we can talk about that. I mean, so that's
let's talk about that, because we're trying to help people that are, so talk about surge capacity.
Yeah, so that's from Ann Maston, and it's a term she used in this article called "Your Surge Capacity is Depleted. It's Why You Feel Awful." So that was an article released in 2020. So a surge capacity is a collection of adaptive systems, mental and physical, that humans draw on for short-term survival in acutely stressful situations, such as natural disasters, right? However, natural disasters are short period and pandemics are long. And so I know that Amy Cuddy has talked about this before in speeches. She's written about this too. A lot of people jumped on and started to explain pandemic flux syndrome, which that's what Amy discussed. It builds on that idea of surge capacity. It says, okay, so people are dealing with an extended fight or flight, anxiety and depression response put together, right? So the anxiety is fight or flight. That's the sympathetic nervous system. It drives you to fight or flee. You can't really fight or flee a pandemic. So there's just this continued release of cortisol and then a collapse response of depressive affect. I say that because it might not be major depressive disorder. It might be just sadness, exhaustion, collapse response, which is different because it's not, we don't have to get into all that, but people say, I feel depressed. Well, sadness is really a feeling. Depressed mood is a disorder. And that's a whole different podcast we could have. But so there's this up and down of, oh my gosh, I'm not safe. I got to protect myself. And then, wow, I'm exhausted from doing that. And then repeat, rinse and repeat. And we're not made for that. Fun fact.
What does that do to our nervous systems?
Right. It creates an overwhelming sense of anxiety and symptoms from that. We know stress has multiple impacts on the body and mind. It burns you out. It causes burnout, in other words, and it causes some sense of depression. And on that level of experiencing stress continually, you may have adrenal problems. You may have just a burnout impact that causes you not to care about anything in general, right? You've been through such extended anxiety that there's nothing there left to give physiologically in your body. So your mind kind of is impacted by that as well. Obviously, that's an understatement. I mean, you look at people who have multiple episodes of adverse childhood experiences, the ACE study bears that out, and we won't have to get all into that, but it was a study done, it was longitudinal by Kaiser Permanente that showed that people who had early childhood experiences of trauma, the more they had, the more negative the prognosis for mental and physical health, like autoimmune disorders are associated with early childhood trauma and abuse. So just think about this prolonged, and I'm not saying it's the same to quarantine as it is to be actively abused, but by the way, neglect is its own form of abuse. So if you're completely isolated as a single person in an apartment, let's say, however many millions that happened to, if you're isolated and your only way of interacting or getting comfort was to hang out with your friends, and you're not allowed to do that, essentially, you don't feel safe doing it, that's a massive loss. Okay, so what we're dealing with is people are creatures of habit. So if you habituated and trained people to be alone, and you then say, okay, well, what you can do for dating is video dating on Zoom. What you can do is this, and you can kind of, I get it, but there was, I think, a hastening of our we already had a culture of isolation that was mounting due to online dating, commodification of relationships, swipe-based culture, disposability culture, I call it, and then massively tightened. It went probably 5 years ahead of where we were going to be organically from 2020 to now. Right now, it's 3 years later, but I'm saying even from 2020 and 2021, we saw this massive move to people as faces on a screen, that we were moving toward but we were thrown into it. And the numbers of Gen Z depression and suicidal ideation, all of that stuff bear that out. Like they're a generation that was forced to be digital. So didn't, I mean, we talk about people using TikTok, we talk about how Gen Z's all plugged in. Well, why wouldn't they be? Look, they were forced to put on graduation robes and caps and stand in front of Zoom. I mean, my gosh.
Yeah. That doesn't just break your heart, just even like that, those words coming out of your mouth. And it's just, I mean, something as the rite of passage of a high school graduation, these kids missed, and prom, and, you know, people had to move their wedding dates, and all of these things that just mount up to us. And so all of that, for us to, on this podcast, build a case for everybody who is listening, that you no doubt have something left over from the pandemic that you need to pay attention to. And so what I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, is a couple questions, because I promised some of my listeners I would. And so let's talk about kids that were cognizant enough. So first, second grade in 2020. So I don't know what age that puts them. And in Florida, they were back in school sooner, but in much of the country, they were shut down, put on screens, taken away from their friends, all of that. What does that do to the developmental brain of, let's say, because you brought up Gen Z, which I think is what I wanted to talk about. And so, you know, let's say from second grade right now, which means they would have had kindergarten at home all the way through middle school. What did the pandemic do to that age group, just based on what you know as a professional, and where they are developmentally, and the needs that were not met because of COVID?
Great question. I mean, it's tough to know because there's so many different factors. A kid who was already precocious and social would have been impacted less than someone who maybe already had some developmental or social deficits compared to peers, right? So that would have been out of the gate a factor. And then the COVID would have just made it worse. So let's see. Well, facial recognition, people wearing masks, not being accustomed to seeing smiles from the mouth region, just the eyes. I know we had to adapt. People would say like, oh, you want to really smile with your eyes when you're wearing a mask, you know, and that was something that people who were forward-facing employees were told to do in service industry. So that's one thing. So how would it impact kids? Well, I want to give some hope, right? So,
Yeah,
but if you're, it's like you say, in the past, we were told, you know, putting kids in front of a TV was a way to rot their brains, and it would lead them to not have social skills, you know, those kind of things. So I think that's not necessarily true. If you see, like, if you're watching a program that requires a lot of cognitive energy and it's something that's very learning heavy, something where you're learning some lessons, or it's literature based and you're seeing people's interactions. I mean, we notice other human beings' facial expressions. We have a lot of capacity for a lot of brain regions are active when we're noticing other human beings, right? With mirror neurons, that's an entire subject. So but with isolation from face-to-face interactions and not practicing those, that's going to be a problem for kids during those kind of rite of passage interactions with other children, where you learn to respond and share and engage in social practices that we take for granted. So when we move everything online, shyness is amplified in kids that already are predisposed to it. Okay. Inability to communicate and make common and form bonds with other children is amplified.
So attachment styles come into play there.
They do. So attachment styles it's an interesting one. So those can be changed. Really, that comes down to, what has the parent put in place there? Does the child have a secure base? Because we know from Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby that a lot of that's based on mother or primary caregiver attachment, right? So what is your relationship to your primary caregiver during COVID times? Does your mom or father or grandmother or aunt or whatever have a story time with you or talk to you? I mean, we could go back here, and for some hope, we can look at, this is a funny word from what I'm going to describe next, but like the orphanage, Romanian orphanage, not experiments, because they weren't intended that way, but we know that kids that were neglected in orphanages don't have the same capacity for social engagement. Now, there's ways that that can be alleviated and shored up and helped. But if you're during critical periods, talking to your child is absolutely essential for their neurocognitive development. So as long as that's happening and there are ways to buffer that incoming stress, which it's about resilience, buffering that with doing something like taking a walk and naming the animals, doing something like incorporating technology and talking about a video that you watch, talking about what the kids are doing on a show, doing something to fire up the kid's brain to think of what you do in social situations, like real-time engagement. There's ways to make that up from parent to child in the meantime. But if parents are working and the schools are doing it and all you can do is have interaction on Zoom, I don't know. I can't speak to Zoom lecture school. I can say that other kids are involved and I think there's engagement there. Depending on the age, that's more or less helpful. But there is hope because primary caregiver involvement there for attachment styles is would definitely teach the kid that you can be safe, you're loved. And that's that foundation that attachment's built on. Now, they might be more awkward or feel more awkward talking to their peers, but they'll know like, well, I'm loved, I'm cool, I can get through this. And they'll be likely to fail forward. Because I think that's what's lost by COVID is to give everyone an excuse who didn't want to interact to not interact.
Right. Yeah. And those that were already suffering from mental illness, particularly major depressive disorder, it gave them permission to stay on lockdown and stay inside and stay in dark rooms.
Bingo.
Yeah. It just gave it just like gave a big check mark, like green check mark here that, this was developed just for you. And that's where I think we're seeing increase in suicide, among these major depressive disorders, because some of them stopped taking their medicines and because they didn't go to the doctor, because some people, and this is where I'd like to ask my next question. There were people and are people who were almost paralytically afraid of the COVID-19 virus. Like they were so afraid of it. And now we're kind of moving into adults. They were so afraid of it that their lives just kind of fell apart. And that's where we see in the literature where some of the downfalls or the effects on mental health were related to finances, for example, because people just couldn't, when it came time to go back to work, they were too afraid to go back to work. And so now we're talking about something as simple as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like where people began not even being able to meet their basic needs as a result of this cultural trauma that we went through. And so I love back for just a second. I loved your answer on how to help kids, and that help comes in a counselor's office, and it comes in parents. And there is such hope in that, right? Because kids are resilient. Like one of my friend's kids just had a appendectomy yesterday morning and was home last night. Had that been you or me, they would still be, trying to get us to drink something so we can leave the hospital. And so I do want that to serve as hope to parents out there who are listening. There's great resiliency for kids who have lived through the early parts of COVID. It is your job, though, to get them help that they need, and also to help them meet those benchmarks that they miss, like conflict resolution on the playground, or missing these benchmarks, teaching them to properly grieve. Hey, yes, you missed your senior prom. Yes, you're a 2020 graduate, and everybody's always going to say, oh, you graduated in 2020. That must have sucked. But I do love that you gave us hope for that, for the adult, particularly for those who have either PTSD, have lived trauma, have high ACE scores like I do. I know the answer is still counseling, but what do you say to the person listening to this podcast right now who has not sought professional help, who is still suffering from the effects of the pandemic, whether it be financial, social distancing, they lost something, right? I think one thing that didn't get highlighted a lot during the pandemic is this loss that some people lost, like a wedding date that you dreamed, that you built for, you planned this this marriage, this wedding for 2 years, and all of a sudden people tell you can't go anymore. And so it's those little insidious things that as adults, I know my listeners are out there going, this is still bothering me. or when I go to the grocery store, I still grab an extra thing of toilet paper. And so how can you help us have post-pandemic growth? I know we have to go to counseling. That has been clear, particularly a trauma-informed counselor. But do you have any practical advice for those of us who are living post-pandemic, who are just trying to figure out how to use your word, and I love this word, be resilient, and say that did not irrevocably, this collective cultural trauma did not change my identity. How can we work towards pre-2020 in the ways that there's some things that need to be left there, and there's some things we need to go back and pick up? How can adults walk through this now?
Mhm. Well, it's a great question, and there's quite a few different answers there, and I'm going to shock you. I think it comes across sometimes as disingenuous or as a money grab when therapists in particular promote the therapy profession constantly.
Right.
There's people who have good reason to not want therapy if they had bad counseling before. So I get that. And all therapy is not created equally. So someone who is just insight based as a therapist and wants to just talk every week, just ask you about the crisis of the week, you're not going to get anywhere that way. If you're feeling like that's hollow and it's not going anywhere, you're probably right. What does go somewhere is addressing whatever crisis of the week you're having, if that's what's happening, at a systemic root of desensitizing the trigger, the physical trigger to that. Whatever anxiety or fear, even primal fear, whatever element there is triggering that. So if you can't do that in therapy, you're just not ready for it, or it's too financially exhausting right now on an idea, then working on resilience yourself is certainly possible. So a big element of it is going to be noticing what elicits physical reactions in you, what elicits anxiety, what causes anxiety, leaning into it, noticing it, developing a mindful attitude. So noticing without judging. Oh, I'm tightening up right now when I look at the toilet paper roll of the supermarket, to use your example, of noticing that you need to be prepared and have more, right? That comes from this startling new paradigm that we had to adopt that was driven by anxiety. And so anxiety is a very powerful memory tool. Your brain doesn't want to have to experience that thought of possibly dying. And so you'll probably do what you did before to avoid that, avoid the fear, avoid the possibility of it. So experiment with not doing it. Push yourself slowly outside your comfort zone. So those are two things already we're talking about. We're talking about being mindful, which really all that means is being present focused. If you have a fear about what could happen, bring yourself
To the here and now.
to the present and say, that might be, but is that just an echo of past anxiety? Is okay. If it is, I'm just going to distract myself right now. Look around. Learn what relaxes you and what brings you a calm sense of determination, or a relatively calm sense of excitement. So not panic, right? Remind yourself that anxiety and excitement are somewhat similar, by the way. Biologically, there's a whole field called anxious reappraisal therapy that has people repeat themselves, I'm excited, when they're anxious, and see if that new label can take. So that's cool. Behavioral activation therapy is a gold standard that I was breaking out with clients during the pandemic and after, especially. So it's an offshoot of cognitive behavior therapy, which is challenging maladaptive, meaning negative cognitions and unrealistic cognitions, and doing experiments to get outside of your comfort zone and testing those. Like, am I going to have an absolute meltdown if I don't get every word right at a public speaking event? And if you don't, it's like, oh, I taught myself that anxiety was overblown. Okay. And your brain catches to that. It's like,
wow,
when your brain catches up to that new experience. So that's something you can do in the here and now, is notice that you don't want to do something. Okay. Rate your mood beforehand. Like, oh, I don't want to go out with friends. I don't think that'll make me feel better. Go out, and then rate your mood afterwards. Be honest with yourself. Did I feel better after that? Even a little bit? Oh, then I'm not good at forecasting my emotional state in the future. By the way, people are horrible at emotional forecasting, is what it's called. We think that things are going to bring us more happiness than they do, or that we're going to be more sad than we really are. over different things. There's research behind that. So I really encourage clients to start doing their own behavioral activation experiments. Go out
So
and
give me an example
yeah,
of that, because you're
I think
fascinating me right now.
sure. An example of that would be what I just said about going out with friends. So if people will say, I'm in a bad mood and I just want to be alone. Okay. By the way, very common, very wrong. So that amplified, we were just talking about this a few minutes ago, that it gave people who were already depressed, quarantine plummeted them into more isolation. And isolation is the worst thing for depression. One of the worst things. It's awful. So, but it's what we think is going to be good. It's what feels right, right? That's not always true. Emotions don't always serve your best interests. Emotions are like a lot. You can have a smoke detector that goes off and it's telling you there's a fire there. And also the smoke detector can go off to tell you that you need more batteries in it. And that's what emotions are usually when you're experiencing a mental illness. They're like depression is telling you there's a problem here. It's not telling you that you really need to be sad and all those things are true. So you cannot trust your emotions always. Again, we are bad as a species at emotional forecasting, at predicting how we're going to feel in the future. So a big thing is drawing on supportive socialization, laughing with friends. If you don't feel like it, then maybe you should do it, right? Like if your therapist is telling you to stay in your comfort zone longer than you should, that's not great. Like you need to get out of it, and not so much that you collapse and feel overwhelmed. That's the job of a responsible therapist, or for someone who is getting to know him or herself, is how much can I get outside of my comfort zone right now? Because I need to. That's the only way we grow, by the way, is through new experiences and pushing outside of the negative mood. So with exercise, a huge one is to narrow how much you're going to work out based on what you think you can handle. So getting out and doing it, getting out and being at the gym, walking on the treadmill for 10 minutes. I don't care if it's 5 minutes. Get out there and do it if exercise is one of your goals, because it does release endorphins. It does cause an improved mood quite often. The research is so unbelievably clear. It's one of the biggest things we have in psychotherapy research is the impact of the impact of exercise on depression. We know it's massive. We know that physical activity and depression are inversely correlated.
Wow.
So exercise decreases depression, in other words, depressive symptoms. Okay. So that's not me saying it. It's years and years of studies and literature. So the biggest obstacle for you feeling overwhelmed, like you can't do a lot of exercise, eliminate that, chunk it, make it smaller chunks of something that, and then see how you feel afterward. That is behavioral activation therapy.
Wow. I love that. And I think that that's a good takeaway for adults. And so we talked about kids, we talked about adults. It's a good takeaway for those of you, and whether it's pandemic related or not, suffering from depression, anxiety, all of its friends, as I call it. And I know from personal experience about the exercise thing. I tell people all the time, like when I kind of get in one of those states where I am maybe what somebody would describe as depressed, though I don't, that's not something I think I clinically suffer with, but everybody gets down. And I will oftentimes, Jeremy, be sitting in my room watching YouTube videos and just like feeling really badly about myself and feeling really down. And this started during the pandemic because I mean, I'm an extrovert. I go outside, I do all the things. And I tell people all the time that the most important 25 steps that I could take are from my bedroom to my car and then to the gym. And it's just those 25 steps from my door to the gym that is the hardest to do. But man, once I get in that car and once I'm on that treadmill, you're right. The endorphins, which is just a fancy name for a chemical in your brain that makes you feel good, does kick in. And so as we are discussing and coming towards the end of this particular podcast of the effects of the pandemic, I think you have given my listeners you've given parents some good advice that you can mitigate. Kids are super resilient. They are way more resilient than we are. And so you can mitigate the effects of the social issues. You can mitigate the effects of the educational decline. Remember, guys,
Mhm.
I'm a teacher, parents out there, if your kid is a year behind, it's not the end of the world. If they're 2 years behind, it's not the end of the world. The most important thing for you to establish with them is what Jeremy told us, is by using attachment styles and encouraging them to get out and do the things that we know are good for kids and that they lost during the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of kids, I will tell you, Jeremy, that I live in Florida where nobody wears masks. But if I see a mask on, it's in two different generations. It's in the extremely elderly generation, which is a big portion of our population here in Florida, or it's Gen Zs, because Gen Zs are afraid of they're kids, right? They didn't have the adult brain to figure out. I mean, we couldn't figure it out. Like you said, when they were sending ships to New York because so many people needed hospital rooms, the adult
Right,
mind couldn't wrap their head around it. And so
right.
there are Gen Z kids out there that are afraid, that may become germaphobes, may even turn into something like a obsessive compulsive disorder. But what you've done here today is given parents hope that they have everything they need and their skill set to bring their children out of this, in addition to therapy. I think that we both know that therapy is always the answer. And I just want to close with this. Not everyone can afford to see a trauma-informed counselor. Some people listening to this podcast can only afford to do something in the biblical counseling lane, where they are licensed mental health professionals, but they don't particularly have some of the aces in their pockets, like EMDR, like cognitive behavior therapy, like behavioral activation therapy. What do you say to that person that's like, look, I got $60 to go to my church counselor, but I want to get out of this activated state that COVID put me in? Are there some things that they could be doing at home? There's podcasts like this. You guys should follow Jeremy on Instagram. It's What Jeremy Fox Says. He's often on there dropping some gems. But there are people, Jeremy, out there that are listening to this and was like, that's great, Jeremy, but I can't afford to go to therapy. What do I do? And then I'll
Okay.
close
Well,
the podcast with this question.
sure. There's a few different things there. For one, I would say don't give up hope, because I know in Colorado there were VAIL grants, and that stood for like victims something. It was an acronym. So that would pay for therapy. You can go on to Open Path Collective. You search that term and you'll find a website for reduced cost therapy that is like 50 to 60 bucks, I believe. I don't know if the price have gone up with inflation, but and there are people on there, by the way, who provide EMDR therapy. So there's different kind of things you can do. You can look for someone who was newly trained in EMDR. You can go to emdria.org and look for people who are basic trained and who work at community mental health settings. You can go look for community mental health centers in your area and ask if anyone there is trained in trauma-informed care and EMDR therapy. And a lot of those places will give you reduced cost services if you can prove that you have low income. And there are ways you can do that are solid. Or you give you indigent care. Like if you are reduced income enough, it won't cost anything. So there are ways to do that. It's just not going to be
easy.
What happened. Well, it might be easy. What I was going to say is it isn't going to be that venue of the private practice therapist that you hear about maybe at your church who's cash only. Like, no, they're not going. They may actually do some pro bono work as a way to give back. That's often a common thing done. But no, it's not going to be like private practice Joe Schmo, because they've probably moved out of working at one of those places, maybe, and don't in their trajectory where they don't want to do that. And I'm not, no shame, but there's lots of people who want to give back. What would I say to the person who doesn't want to be activated anymore, who doesn't have the money for trauma therapy? Well, I would say work on your resilience and get some solid self-help books like What Happened to You by Oprah and Bruce Perry. Get The Body Keeps the Score, and be aware there's some trauma narratives in there, but learn more about yourself and what happens to your brain when you're activated. Get a solid self-help plan that involves something like behavioral activation interventions. Check out what kind of stuff you can get pointed to from trauma-informed books, like The Body Remembers is another book by Babette Rothschild, and it has different information in there about what happens from trauma triggers and anxiety. Check out breathwork books. we can attach one to this podcast that's really good. I want to make sure I have the name of it right, but so I'm just not, we'll attach that. But there's books out there now that teach how to do really mindful breath work that's relaxing. The Muse headband is amazing if you can drop like a one-time investment of under $300 for a headband that teaches you how to meditate and stay present. I mean, that's worth tons of therapy sessions in itself. You can follow different meditations online if they're from actual yoga or cool meditation instructors and not just some video that you don't know where it's from. I would suggest breath work exercise is great. I mean, it depends on every person's case. There's all kinds of examples of things you can do for yourself that are body focused, that help you to desensitize from safely, and that aren't as powerful as therapy, obviously, but teach you on your own. Well, they are actually. There's a lot that you can do self-therapy wise. I'm just being careful what I call it, because I'm not prescribing. I'm not saying that it's something that's the same as therapy.
This is in lieu of, And I think one of the main things to highlight here is the importance of desire to get well, right?
Yes.
Because the human condition, if we want to do something, we will figure out how to do it. And so it was always the vision of this podcast is to help people who can't afford counseling, both by content that we've created here today and by the awarding of scholarships to people who can't afford counseling. And so, guys, I love all of those things that Jeremy just gave you, books and all of the things, and I will go through and put all of those in the show links. But I also like to announce today, and Jeremy, I'm not sure if we've done this with you yet, but it is time for us to award one of those scholarships. And I usually do it in the name of people who contribute to either the podcast or to the field. And so we are awarding today the Jeremy Fox Scholarship. It is a scholarship for $225 for people who can't afford counseling. And so if you are interested in applying for that, just hit that Contact Amy link. And there are ways to do that. Depending on the therapist, they have gift cards, and there's ways for us to pay for a counseling session for somebody who needs it. And Jeremy, I would like to do that in your name today. Last year we gave out 8 of those scholarships. And so far this year, we're up to 3. And so, well, Jeremy, thank you so much for being here with us today. I think that we've covered a lot. I hope that we've helped some of you out there who are sometimes sitting in your car wondering why you still feel super anxious, wondering why you don't want to go to that thing that you've gone to for 17 years in a row, wondering, those of you who are constantly worried about the financial woes of COVID, because some people are still heavily affected by the financial woes of COVID. For those of you who have lost people, I hope that we have provided some hope for you here today, and by way of counseling, by way of resources that are out there. And all of you know that this is a podcast that is based on the star of the story, who is Jesus, and who I believe has to be part of your answer. And so as we play ourselves out of the podcast, I would like for you to just think of those things. And Jeremy will be back in a couple weeks. And we won't be talking about this, but we will be talking about some buzzwords, like especially stuff that he is covering on his Instagram account, like what are intrusive thoughts, and so some things that you guys might hear thrown around all the time. Jeremy will be back in a couple weeks to tell us about, because this is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so until 2 weeks, when we come back with Jeremy for that episode, I hope that you guys have a great 2 weeks and that you have benefited from this. Please reach out to myself or reach out to Jeremy. Both of that contact information will be included in the show notes. Until then, you guys remember, you are seen, you are known, you are heard, you are loved, and you are valued.
Here I am, you can see that I'm nowhere near where I want to be, but you